a beautiful and touching love story between a rude millionaire and his stubborn maid. The rain fell heavily on the roof of the old mansion in the Montana countryside, a place as grand as it was desolate. Each drop seemed to echo through the empty corridors, as if trying to fill the absolute silence that dominated the space. Damien Westwood was in his office, sitting in his black leather armchair, staring at the fire in the fireplace as if he could find answers in the dancing flames. He was a man who carried on his shoulders more than the weight of a fortune, but the weight of secrets that, try as he might, he couldn't bury. In the center of the room, a black and white photograph rested on the table. The silver frame was marked by a deep scratch, almost as if someone had tried to erase the past portrayed there. Damien picked up the photo with hesitant fingers and stared at the face of a young woman, her eyes full of hope. He closed his eyes as if the sight was unbearable and let out a heavy sigh. That same evening, Liv Bennett arrived at the mansion for the first time. Her heart was racing, both from anxiety and exhaustion. She had come from a long bus journey, carrying only a worn suitcase and an envelope with instructions for her new job. Liv was practical, but she couldn't ignore the shiver that ran up her spine when the iron gate creaked open. The immensity of the place, surrounded by pine trees and shrouded in mist, looked more like a movie set than a residence. As soon as she entered, she was greeted by Margaret, the head housekeeper, a rigid woman with her hair up in a tight bun and a posture that didn't allow for questions. "You must be Liv Bennett." Margaret's voice was cold, without a trace of welcome. "Mr. Westwood doesn't like to be disturbed. Do your job and stay out of his way." Liv just nodded, feeling a palpable tension in the air. Margaret guided her to her room, a modest but comfortable space. However, as Liv unpacked her suitcase, she couldn't help but notice something strange. The silence. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that was heavy on the ears, as if the place was hiding something. Before I continue this heartwarming story, I'd like to ask you for something very special. Subscribe to my channel and help me reach my dream of 3,000 subscribers. Now, let's continue. The next morning, Liv began to explore the house while doing her chores. The mansion was a maze of endless corridors, rooms that never seemed to be used, and windows that let in just enough light to create unsettling shadows. As she passed the corridor on the second floor, she noticed a door ajar. Inside, she found a room that looked like it hadn't been touched for years. The smell of dust and old paper filled the air, but what caught her eye was a wooden box on a table. Against her better judgment, Liv opened the box. Inside were letters yellowed by time, all written in careful handwriting. She picked one up and read it quickly. "Dear Damien, the nights are getting colder and colder without you here. I don't know how long I can bear this distance. Please write to me. Tell me you still think of me as I think of you." Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Liv quickly put the letter away and closed the box. Her heart was pounding as the door opened, revealing Damien Westwood. He was standing there with an expression so intense that it made the air seem heavy. "What are you doing here?" His voice was low, but carried an authority that couldn't be ignored. Liv stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, but Damien just stepped forward, picked up the box and left without saying another word. The look on his face, however, remained etched in her mind. It was a mixture of anger and pain, as if she had invaded something sacred. Over the next few days, Liv noticed that Damien's behavior oscillated between indifference and a kind of silent vigilance. He rarely spoke to her, but his eyes seemed to follow her, assessing her every move. Liv tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling, but she couldn't deny her growing curiosity about the man and the secrets he kept so fiercely. On the third night, while everyone was asleep, Liv heard a sound coming from downstairs. It was almost imperceptible, but enough to wake her up. She went downstairs slowly, barefoot, trying not to make a sound. When she reached the library, she saw Damien sitting in front of the fireplace with the same photograph in his hands. "You don't know when to give up, do you?" His voice cut through the silence, making Liv freeze. I heard something and I thought it might be..." She didn't finish her sentence. Damien stood up and walked over to her, his imposing presence filling the room. He held the photograph so tightly that he seemed about to break it. "This house is not a place for the curious, Ms. Bennett. If you don't learn to respect that, perhaps you should reconsider your position here." Liv swallowed, but something in her expression made him hesitate. Damien looked away and left the room, leaving Liv alone with the crackling flames. She glanced at the table where he stood and noticed that, as well as the photograph, there was an envelope with a single word written on it: pardon. That night, Liv couldn't sleep. The questions in her mind multiplied. Who was the woman in the photo? And what did that envelope mean? More importantly, what had happened in that mansion to turn Damien into such a tormented man? The air seemed colder than ever when Liv finally closed her eyes, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The soft sound of raindrops against the window was what woke Liv up the next morning. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. While the memories of the night before unfolded like pages of a book she no longer wanted to read, but couldn't close. The photograph, the envelope with the word pardon on it, Damien's expression. It was all a mystery that was beginning to wrap around her like an invisible web. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. "It's not my problem," she muttered to herself, but she knew that this lie sounded empty even to her own ears. Something about that house attracted her in a way she couldn't explain. Damien Westwood wasn't just a mysterious man, he was an enigma that Liv was beginning to feel the need to decipher. The morning passed uneventfully. Liv went about her tasks in the main hall, while Margaret, as always, supervised everything with a watchful eye. The housekeeper seemed even more taciturn than usual, as if she was monitoring Liv's every move. "Something wrong, Margaret?" Liv risked asking as she polished the surface of a dark wooden table. Margaret just gave her a sharp look. "You look tired, Miss Bennet. I hope that doesn't interfere with the quality of your work." Liv held her tongue, but the comment only served to increase her determination. Something was being hidden in that house, and not just by Damien. Margaret also seemed to know more than she was willing to admit. While cleaning a shelf full of decorative objects, Liv noticed a small crystal sculpture that seemed out of place among the other pieces. She lifted it up, watching it against the light, but before she could examine it more closely, Damien entered the room. "You always find ways to be where you shouldn't be," he commented, his voice as icy as the wind in a winter storm. Liv quickly put the sculpture back, but didn't back down. "I was just cleaning up. It's part of my job, Mr. Westwood." Damien narrowed his eyes as if he didn't believe a word of it. He took a step forward, stopping a few meters away from her. "This house has rules, Miss Bennet. One of them is that you must know when not to cross certain boundaries." "And what are those limits?" Liv asked before she could stop herself, courage rising from a place she didn't even know existed. Damien tilted his head, surprised by her boldness. For a brief moment, a flicker of something flashed across his face. Respect, perhaps. But then, like a door closing abruptly, his expression returned to a mask of indifference. "Get to work. Don't ask. Don't touch what isn't yours." He left, leaving Liv with her heart racing and her hands shaking. Despite the tension, she couldn't help feeling that this confrontation had opened a small crack in Damien's armor. Later, while Liv was organizing the pantry, she heard voices coming from Damien's office. The low, intense tone suggested an argument. She hesitated, knowing she should ignore it, but curiosity spoke louder. Moving silently, she approached the half-open door. "This can't go on, Damien," said a male voice full of frustration. "You can't just bury the past and pretend it doesn't exist." "I'm not pretending anything," Damien replied, his voice controlled but charged with tension. "What happened was my responsibility, and I'm dealing with it in my own way." "Your way? By withdrawing from everything and everyone? That's not coping, that's running away." Before Liv could hear any more, the sound of footsteps made her heart race. She ran back to the pantry, trying to look busy as Margaret passed her in the hallway. Whatever was going on, it was clear that Damien was fighting something that went beyond his own inner demons. At the staff dinner, Margaret, as usual, kept the atmosphere under control with her austere presence. But that night, Liv decided to test the boundaries. "Margaret, has Mr. Westwood always been so reserved?" she asked casually, trying not to sound intrusive. The other waiters stopped eating for a moment, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Margaret slowly put down her fork, fixing her eyes on Liv. "Damien Westwood is a man who lives by the rules he himself has set. It's not for us to question that." There was something in her tone that sounded more like a warning than an answer, but Liv realized she wouldn't be able to get anything out of it. Later that night, Liv was about to go to bed when she heard a sound coming from downstairs again. It was as if someone was walking through the house, but the footsteps were spaced out, almost hesitant. This time, she decided not to ignore it. She grabbed a coat and left the room, moving carefully through the dimly lit corridors. The footsteps led her to the library again. She peeked through the door and saw Damien sitting at the table, his shoulders tense as he stared at something in his hands. Liv hesitated, but her curiosity was stronger. She pushed the door slightly, just enough to make Damien aware of her presence. "What are you doing here?" he asked without looking at her. "I heard something and I thought—" Liv stopped. She didn't know how to finish her sentence. Damien finally looked up, but instead of the irritation she had expected, there was something softer in his eyes. He was holding the same photograph Liv had seen before. "You don't know what you're asking for, Liv," he said, his voice low but full of weight. "Maybe not," she replied, taking a step forward. "But I do know that something is destroying you, and maybe you need help." Damien laughed, but the sound was empty, almost bitter. "Help? Do you think you can help someone like me?" Liv crossed her arms, facing him firmly. "I don't know, but maybe you should try." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Damien sighed and put the photograph on the table. "The woman in the picture was my wife." Liv felt a tightness in her chest. "Was she?" Damien nodded, looking away. "She died 5 years ago, and it was my fault." These words fell like a weight in the room, leaving Liv breathless. Before she could ask any more, Damien stood up abruptly, picked up the photograph and left the library, leaving Liv alone with a wave of questions that seemed to have no end. She looked down at the table and saw the envelope with the word "pardon" on it. Liv knew she was at the center of something much bigger than she had imagined, and for the first time, she wondered if she was ready to face what came next. The next morning, Liv woke up with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The previous night's conversation with Damien echoed in her mind. She thought of the moment when he reluctantly confessed that his wife had died, and even more so, that he believed he was to blame for it. Despite his coldness, Damien had shown a vulnerability that Liv hadn't expected, and for a moment she felt that she had gotten close to him. But when she went down to the kitchen that morning, Damien seemed like a completely different man. He passed her in the hallway without even looking away, as if Liv wasn't there. His face was as expressionless as a mask, and the cold weight of his indifference hit her hard. "Good morning, Mr. Westwood," Liv ventured. He stopped, but not to answer. He just turned his head enough to cast a blank glance in her direction. "Call Margaret." His words were sharp, and he continued walking without waiting for an answer. Liv felt her chest tighten. Any trace of humanity he had shown the night before seemed to have disappeared completely. When Margaret arrived, Damien called her into the study. Liv, curious, stood nearby, trying to hear what was being discussed, but the thick walls of the mansion muffled the sounds. A few minutes later, Margaret came out and stopped in front of Liv with her typical stern expression. "Mr. Westwood asked me to inform you that the library is off limits. You must not enter there under any circumstances." "Did he say why?" Liv asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but Margaret didn't give her the chance to ask any more questions. "Don't question it. Just do as you're told." Margaret left without looking back, leaving Liv alone in the corridor. The rest of the day was an exercise in frustration for Liv. At every opportunity, she tried to bump into Damien around the house, but he ignored her with an almost calculated skill. If he saw her in a corridor, he changed direction. If he was in a room and she entered, he left immediately. When he had to speak to her, his words were monosyllabic and full of indifference. In the afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs corridors, Liv spotted Damien coming out of one of the rooms, looking visibly tense. He didn't realize she was watching him, and Liv took advantage of the moment to follow his footsteps from a distance. He hurried down the stairs and into the library, closing the door behind him tightly. Liv stood still for a moment, staring at the closed door. Her mind whirled with questions. What was he hiding in there? Why had he suddenly forbidden her to enter that place? That same evening, during the staff dinner, Liv tried to strike up a conversation with some of the other employees. "Does anyone know what happened to Mr. Westwood's wife?" she asked, trying to sound casual as she munched on her food. All eyes turned to her, but the silence was almost deafening. One of the gardeners, a man called Henry, lowered his eyes to his plate, clearly uncomfortable. Margaret, who was also at the table, cast a cutting glance at Liv. "That kind of question is inappropriate, Miss Bennet," said the housekeeper, her voice as cold as a blade. "I would suggest that you concentrate on your responsibilities." But before Liv could answer, Henry sniffed and ventured a few words. "All I know is that his wife is no longer with us, but no one here knows how or why." He paused, glancing at Margaret, as if aware that he was crossing a dangerous line. Margaret stood up abruptly, ending the conversation with her mere presence. "Enough of that. We have work to do tomorrow, and I suggest you all get some rest." Liv wanted to press further, but the tension in the room was palpable. Reluctantly, she decided not to insist. Over the next few days, Liv began to realize that there were more mysteries than just the death of Damien's wife. The other employees avoided the subject completely, and Margaret became even more stern whenever she noticed Liv's curiosity. Damien, for his part, continued with his cold, indifferent demeanor, as if the conversation in the library had never happened. He seemed to have closed any door that Liv had managed to open in his soul. But even with all his attempts to ignore her, Liv couldn't help but notice the signs that he was struggling with something. Sometimes she would see him sitting on the terrace, staring at the horizon with a distant, pained expression. At other times, she heard him walking around the house late at night, as if the silence was suffocating him. Liv knew that she should follow Margaret's advice and remain oblivious, but the truth was that she couldn't do it. The mansion, Damien, the past he was trying to bury, it all seemed to be calling out to her, as if it were impossible to ignore. One evening, as she passed through the corridor leading to the library, Liv stopped when she heard low voices coming from inside. She recognized Damien's voice, but there was another one, softer and more feminine. Who could it be? She approached the door and put her ear to it. "That doesn't change anything," Damien said, his voice tense. "Do you think you can hide forever?" asked the other voice. Before Liv could hear any more, the sound of footsteps coming from the corridor made her move away quickly. Margaret appeared, her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" "Nothing. I was just going to my room," Liv replied, trying to sound nonchalant. Margaret looked at the library door and then back at Liv. "You've been warned. Don't test Mr. Westwood's patience." Liv went back to her room with her heart racing, but now she had even more questions. Who was the woman in the library? And why did it seem that Damien was discussing something that he was desperately trying to keep buried? Lying in bed, Liv decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. If no one in that house was willing to give her answers, she would have to find them on her own. The sun had barely risen, but Liv was already awake. She stared at the bedroom window, watching the dewdrops slowly trickle down the glass as her mind revolved around Damien Westwood. Ever since he had arrived at the mansion, he had been a mystery. A man as handsome as he was inaccessible, whose expressions ranged from cold indifference to a pain that seemed to devour him from the inside. Liv didn't understand why he cared so much. He was rude, avoided any closeness, and seemed to do everything to keep her at a distance. But there was something about him that wouldn't let her give up. That night in the library, when he had mentioned his wife's death, had revealed that Damien wasn't just a bitter man, but someone who carried an unbearable weight. "He has a good heart," she murmured to herself as she combed her hair in front of the mirror. She knew that. There were fleeting moments when he let slip a restrained kindness or a look that seemed to beg for help. Liv had the feeling that behind that wall of coldness, there was a man who desperately wanted to be saved. The problem was that he wouldn't let anyone get close. But Liv was determined. The day unfolded like the others. Damien ignoring her completely, Margaret controlling every aspect of the mansion's routine, and the other staff exchanging furtive glances whenever she tried to ask about the past. Liv tried to focus on her work, but her mind was always on Damien. She remembered the conversations they'd had, few but remarkable. He was intelligent, shrewd, and, in rare moments, almost vulnerable. Liv felt a tightness in her chest at the thought of how alone he seemed. Why did he refuse to trust anyone? As she was wiping down the banister of the main staircase, she saw him coming out of his office. He was impeccable as always, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves folded up to his elbows, and walked with an upright posture. But there was something in his expression that betrayed him. His eyes were dark, as if they carried the weight of the world. Liv wanted to say something, but he walked past her without even turning his head. "Good morning, Mr. Westwood," she ventured. even though she knew he probably wouldn't answer. Damien stopped for a second but didn't look at her. "I don't have time for small talk, Miss Bennet." He continued walking, leaving her with a lump in her throat. Liv clutched the cloth in her hands in frustration. "You can't run away forever, Damien," she whispered to herself. Later, while Liv was organizing the main hall, Margaret appeared with her typical stern expression. "Mr. Westwood asked her to remind you again. Don't go into the library." Liv sighed, keeping her composure. Understood. But inside, her curiosity only grew. The library seemed to be the epicenter of all the secrets Damien wanted to hide, and the more he insisted that she stay away, the more she felt she needed to know what was inside. When night fell, Liv couldn't rest. After dinner, she went back to her room, but the mansion seemed alive in a different way at night, as if every shadow told a story. She looked out of the window and saw Damien in the garden. He was standing near the central fountain, his hands in his pockets and his gaze lost in the stars. For a moment, Liv just watched him. The soft moonlight highlighted his perfect features, but it was the sadness in his posture that really caught the eye. He seemed so distant, so broken. Liv knew she shouldn't, but something inside her pushed her towards him. She decided to get ready. She put on a blue silk robe that hugged her body delicately and let down her hair, which fell like a waterfall over her shoulders. She didn't know exactly what she was trying to do, but she wanted Damien to see her, really see her. With silent steps, she went down the stairs and out into the garden. The cool night air made her skin prickle, but Liv was focused only on Damien. He was still standing there, as still as a statue. As she approached, he finally became aware of her presence. His eyes, initially curious, scanned her from top to bottom, and Liv felt the weight of that gaze. For the first time, he seemed unable to maintain his facade of indifference. Damien said nothing, but Liv noticed the tension in his jaw and the strange glint in his eyes. He seemed to be fighting something inside, as if trying to decide whether to push her away or let her come closer. Liv stopped a few steps away, trying to decipher him. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but full of sincerity. Damien blinked, as if snapped out of a trance. "You shouldn't be here, Liv." "Why not?" she retorted, taking a step closer. "You can keep ignoring me during the day, Damien, but that won't stop me from trying to understand you." He gave a short but humorless laugh. "Understand me? Believe me, Miss Bennet, that's an impossible task." Liv crossed her arms, challenging him with her gaze. "Maybe that's because you've never let anyone try." For a moment, silence overtook the garden. The sound of the water in the fountain filled the space between them, but nothing could diminish the intensity of what was happening. Damien looked torn, his eyes locked on Liv's as if he were trying to find the right words. He finally looked away, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're asking. Then tell me." Liv took another step, now centimeters away from him. "Tell me what torments you so much, Damien." He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense, as if they carried the weight of a secret he didn't want to share. But before he could answer, Damien looked up, and his eyes met Liv's again. This time he didn't look away. For an instant that seemed eternal. All that existed was that moment, the stars above, the soft night breeze, and two worlds about to collide. And then Damien took a step back, breaking eye contact. "Good evening, Miss Bennet." He turned and started walking back to the house, leaving Liv in the garden with her heart racing and a mixture of frustration and determination. As he walked away, Liv murmured softly, almost like a promise, "I won't give up on you, Damien." The cool evening breeze gave way to a sudden downpour. Heavy drops began to fall from the dark sky, wetting the garden in a matter of seconds. Liv, who was still near the fountain, felt the cold of the water run over her skin and saw the strands of her hair stick to her face. But instead of running for cover, she simply stood there, raising her face to the sky. It was as if the rain washed everything away, the frustration, the tension of the last few days, even the questions that plagued her. She felt a laugh escape her lips, and before she knew it, she was turning slowly, allowing the drops to fall on her without reservation. Damien saw her through the window. He was upstairs watching the rain when his eyes found her in the garden. He leaned on the sill, crossing his arms, intrigued. There was something almost mesmerizing about the way Liv moved, carefree, as if for a brief moment the weight of the world didn't exist for her. Damien ran a hand through his hair and closed his eyes for a moment. Deep down, He wanted to be there, feeling the rain, not carrying the burdens that haunted him. He wanted to laugh like her, to allow himself a moment's peace, but he knew that was impossible. When he opened his eyes, Liv was looking at him. Their gazes met, and for a second he felt as if she saw him in a way that no one else did, beyond the layers of pain, loneliness, and guilt. Damien turned away quickly, backing away from the window, but Liv knew he had seen her. A soft smile appeared on his lips. She felt that, even for an instant, she had reached some part of him. She decided to walk out onto the balcony of the house, while the rain continued to run down her body. The blue silk robe she was wearing was completely soaked, sticking to her skin and revealing her curves. Liv didn't mind. When she reached the balcony, she rested her hands on the railing, looking out into the darkness of the night. The rain fell mercilessly, but something in her seemed to light up inside. She knew Damien was paying attention. He always was, even when he pretended to ignore her. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of the front door opening. She turned and saw Damien standing there, a towel in his hands. His face was impassive, but his eyes scrutinized her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "You're going to catch a cold," he said, walking towards her with firm steps. Liv laughed softly, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's just a bit of rain." Damien didn't reply immediately. He handed her the towel but didn't leave immediately. His eyes, which were usually so controlled, were different now. He looked at her carefully, analyzing every detail, the wet strands falling over her shoulders, the silk that outlined her body, the soft gleam in her eyes. Liv felt her face heat up, but she didn't look away. It was as if something invisible was being said between them, something that neither of them had the courage to put into words. "Thank you," Liv said, her voice almost a whisper as she picked up the towel. Damien stood still for another moment, as if fighting an impulse. His eyes met hers, and Liv had the feeling that he was about to say something important, but instead, he abruptly turned away. "Don't stay out here too long." He walked back into the house without looking back, leaving Liv alone on the balcony with her towel in her hands and her heart racing. She smiled to herself, feeling a wave of satisfaction. It was a small step forward, but it was something. For once, Damien had broken through her barrier, albeit briefly, and more than that, Liv felt that he was beginning to see her not as an employee, but as someone capable of seeing beyond her scars. As the rain subsided, Liv stood there looking up at the sky, knowing that despite all Damien's resistance, she was beginning to find a way into his world. Sunlight streamed through the mansion's windows, delicately illuminating the polished furniture and spotless walls. Liv was in the hallway, arranging a vase that Margaret had insisted on changing 3 times that week. She was carefully arranging the flowers when she heard footsteps approaching. Her heart raced, recognizing the sound before she even saw it. Damien appeared at the end of the corridor, wearing a white linen shirt and dark pants. He walked with his usual upright and confident posture, but something in his countenance seemed softer. When he passed her, he did something he had never done before. He spoke. "Good morning, Miss Bennet." The words were simple, but to Liv they sounded like music. She paused for a moment, trying to absorb what had just happened. Damien Westwood, the man who had consistently ignored her since her arrival, had said, "Good morning." She managed to reply, although her voice came out a little louder than she had intended. "Good morning, Mr. Westwood." Damien continued walking, without looking back, but Liv stood still for a few seconds, feeling a wave of heat rise through her body. He was finally opening a door, albeit subtly. "I'm moving forward," thought Liv, as a small smile appeared on her lips. Later in the afternoon, Liv was in the main room, dusting a bookshelf that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She was distracted, lost in thought about the last few days, when she heard someone enter the room. She turned and saw Damien standing in the doorway. He looked around for a moment, as if assessing the layout of the room, before walking over to the sofa. Liv tried not to seem affected by his presence, but she felt his gaze on her like a physical weight. Damien sat down on the sofa with his legs crossed and leaned his arm on the backrest. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were fixed on her as she worked. Liv felt her hands tremble slightly as she adjusted the books on the shelf. "Everything is to your satisfaction, Mr. Westwood?" she asked, turning to him with a polite smile. "Yes, it is," he replied in a neutral tone but without looking away. Liv continued her work, but it was impossible to ignore his presence. There was something about the way Damien watched her. It wasn't invasive, but it wasn't casual either. He seemed to be assessing her, as if trying to decipher something about her that he didn't understand. After a while, he stood up, walking slowly over to where Liv stood. She felt her heart race when he stopped beside her, but she didn't expect his next words. "Meet me in the garden tonight, just like yesterday." His tone was firm but not cold. It was more of an instruction than a request. Liv almost dropped the cleaning cloth from her hands. Her mind was racing with possibilities and nerves, but all she could do was nod. "Of course, Mr. Westwood." Damien watched her for a second longer, as if to confirm that she had really understood, before leaving the room without saying another word. The evening came quicker than Liv had expected. The sky was clear, full of stars that shone brightly. Liv spent more time than usual getting ready, although she wanted to look as if she hadn't made such an effort. She chose a simple but elegant dress, made of light fabric that moved gently in the wind. She let down her hair, which fell in natural waves over her shoulders, and decided not to wear makeup. She wanted Damien to see her as she was. When she finally went out into the garden, she felt the cool evening breeze caress her skin. The soft sound of the fountain filled the silence, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Damien was already there, near the fountain, looking up at the sky. He had his hands in his pockets and seemed more relaxed than ever. When he heard Liv's footsteps, he slowly turned around. His eyes met hers, and for a moment time seemed to stop. "You came," he said, as if there was still a slight doubt that she would show up. "Of course. You asked for it." He smiled, but it was a brief smile, like a flash of lightning that appears and disappears quickly on the horizon. Damien gestured for her to come closer, and Liv obeyed, trying to hide her nervousness. When she was only a few steps away, Damien looked at her in a way that made her feel as if he was seeing something beyond the surface, as if he was trying to understand what motivated her, what made her so insistent on getting close to him. "Why are you here, Liv?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. She blinked, confused. "Here?" Damien shook his head slowly. "Not in the garden. In this house. In this world that has nothing to do with you." Liv felt her chest tighten. There were so many answers to this question, but none of them seemed enough. I think I'm here because I believe I can make a difference." Damien raised an eyebrow, almost skeptically. "Make a difference?" Liv shrugged, feeling strangely vulnerable. "You hired me to look after the house, and I do that. But I can see that there's a lot more to look after here than just furniture and bedrooms." Damien laughed, but it was a low, mirthless sound. "Do you think you can fix me?" "No." Liv took a step forward, not realizing she was invading his space. "I think you can fix yourself, but maybe you need help." The two of them stared at each other, and Liv saw the tension in Damien's shoulders intensify. He seemed to want to say something, but couldn't. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes, as deep as the night sky above them, were filled with something Liv couldn't decipher. After a long silence, Damien took a step back. "You don't know what you're asking, Liv. Then show me." The words came out before she could stop herself, and she realized that her voice was full of emotion. Damien looked at her with an almost unbearable intensity. For a moment it seemed as if he was about to give in, to let her into his life. But then, as always, he pulled back. "Good night, Liv." He turned and started walking back to the house. Liv stood still, her hands shaking and her heart racing, as Damien's silhouette disappeared into the darkness. She knew she had achieved something that night, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. And even if he still resisted, Liv was more determined than ever to reach the man she knew was hiding behind that facade of coldness and pain. The mansion was silent when Liv returned to her room. The sound of her own footsteps seemed louder than usual, as if they echoed down the corridors where they shouldn't have. Closing the door behind her, Liv leaned against it, her heart still racing from the encounter in the garden. She ran a hand through her hair, trying to regain control of the emotions that Damien so easily aroused in her. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring into nothingness. The way he looked at her, the intensity of every word he said, it was as if there was a magnetic field between them, something impossible to ignore. But Damien was so closed off, so full of pain, that Liv felt that every little advance was like opening a locked door from the inside. She was lost in these thoughts when she heard a soft knock on the door. Her heart almost stopped. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then the knock was repeated. Liv hesitantly got up and opened the door. Damien was there. He looked different, vulnerable but determined, as if he had come here against his will and at the same time because he couldn't help himself. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. Liv swallowed and nodded, stepping aside so that he could pass. Damien entered the room, his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the floor. When Liv closed the door, he finally looked up at her. "You're taking everything out of place," he said suddenly, his voice sounding almost like a sigh. "What do you mean?" Liv asked, confused. Damien shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Since you arrived, Liv, my life has turned into chaos. I spent 5 years building up a routine, a system that protected me from everything, but now—" He paused, looking directly at her. "You're messing with me in a way I've never allowed anyone to do before." Liv felt her stomach turn. Damien was standing there in front of her, letting down all his defenses. "I tried to ignore it. I tried to walk away. But you don't give up, do you?" He took a step forward, his eyes burning with emotion. "Your insistence? Your curiosity? The way you don't accept my limits?" Liv bit her lip, feeling her face heat up, but said nothing. "And your beauty, Liv," Damien continued, his voice a little lower. "You drove me crazy from the moment you arrived. I can't get you out of my head." Liv didn't know what to say. Her hands were shaking at her sides, but her breathing quickened as Damien took another step closer. "But before you say anything, I need you to know something." He looked away for a moment, as if he needed to gather his courage. "You deserve to know the truth." Liv felt her heart stop. "The truth about what?" Damien ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to get the words out. "About why I live like this. Why I hide." He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice laden with pain. "My wife, Eleanor." He paused for a moment, closing his eyes, as if pronouncing her name was too difficult. "She was pregnant. We were happy, planning everything for the baby's arrival." Liv saw the tightness in his fists as he continued. "But the pregnancy was complicated. The doctors warned us that it would be risky, that we needed to be prepared to act quickly if anything went wrong. I wanted her to give birth in hospital, with all the safety possible, but Eleanor, she was stubborn. She wanted a humanized birth, at home. She said it would be better for her and the baby." Damien began to walk around the room, as if the movement would help him relieve the tension he was feeling. "I tried to argue, but she insisted, and in the end, I gave in. I wanted her to be happy, to have the birth she dreamed of. We called the doctors, prepared everything, but—" His voice faltered, and he stopped, staring at the floor. Liv took a step towards him but didn't interrupt him. "She had complications. Everything fell apart in a matter of minutes. The doctors tried to stabilize her, but they couldn't. We tried to get her to hospital, but there was no time." Liv felt her eyes sting as Damien continued, his voice now a whisper. "I lost them both, Eleanor and our baby, on the same day, at the same moment." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Damien closed his eyes, his fists clenched, as if he were trying to hold back tears. "It was my fault, Liv. I knew it was risky, but I allowed it. I gave in because I wanted her to be happy, and in the end—" He shook his head, unable to continue. Liv took another step, now close enough to touch him. "Damien, you can't blame yourself for this." He laughed, but the sound was bitter. "How could I not? They were the most important people in my life, and I failed them." Liv put her hand on his arm, forcing him to look at her. "You didn't fail them, Damien. You loved them, and you did the best you could with what you knew at the time." Damien stared at her, and Liv saw that his eyes were shining with tears that he refused to shed. "It's easy to say that now, but for the last 5 years, I've lived with this guilt, this emptiness. I've closed myself off from everyone and everything because I don't think I deserve—" "Deserve what?" Liv asked softly. Damien took a deep breath, looking deeply into her eyes. "To be happy." Liv felt her heart squeeze. "Everyone deserves to be happy, Damien. Even you." He was silent for a moment, just staring at her, as if trying to absorb her words. Then, without warning, he stepped forward, eliminating the space between them. "And you, Liv? Why are you here? Why don't you give up on me?" Liv didn't know what to say. She could feel the heat of his body, the intensity of his gaze, and there was no more room for lies. "Because I see something in you, Damien. something you don't see in yourself. He didn't wait any longer. In a move that seemed inevitable, Damien leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was intense, full of need and emotion, as if they had both been holding on for too long. His hands held her face tightly as Liv pulled him closer, tasting the desire that had been contained for days, weeks. Damien finally pulled away, both of them panting, but his eyes never left hers. "You're the only person who's ever made me feel this way, Liv, and that scares me more than anything." Liv touched his face, her fingers light as a breeze. "You don't have to be afraid, Damien. I'm right here." He pulled her closer, and Liv knew at that moment that something had changed. The barriers were coming down, and for the first time, Damien was allowing her to see the man behind the pain. The next morning arrived slowly, bringing shy sunshine through the curtains of Liv's room. She was sitting up in bed, still trying to process everything that had happened the night before. The kiss, Damien's confession, the weight he was carrying, it all seemed surreal. But at the same time, she knew that something inside him had finally changed. Damien had allowed himself to be vulnerable, something Liv never imagined she would witness when she arrived at that mansion. And now, as she listened to the silence around her, she felt a mixture of hope and fear. She was willing to fight for him, but she knew there was still a lot of work to be done. During breakfast, Damien appeared in the kitchen, something of a rarity. He was more casual, without the formality he usually wore as armor. Margaret gave him a surprised look when he took a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, something he never did. Liv entered a few minutes later, hesitant, but Damien raised his eyes and looked at her in a way that made the whole room seem warmer. "Good morning, Liv," he said, with a tone that carried something new, softness. "Good morning, Mr. Westwood," she replied, smiling slightly, even though Margaret was looking her up and down. "Damien," he corrected, his voice firm, but his eyes contained a warmth that left her speechless. Margaret seemed about to say something, but Damien interrupted her. "Margaret, I'd like you to organize lunch to be served in the garden. Something simple. Liv and I will talk there." The housekeeper was clearly surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Westwood." Liv felt her face heat up, but didn't say anything. Damien was watching her in a way that made it seem as if the rest of the world didn't exist. The garden was illuminated by the afternoon sun when Liv and Damien sat down at the table, prepared with meticulous care by Margaret. The breeze carried the scent of the flowers, and the water from the fountain in the background created a peaceful sound. Damien took a deep breath, observing his surroundings. "I never thought I'd enjoy being out here again," he admitted, with an honesty that surprised Liv. "It's a beautiful place. There's something peaceful here," she replied, trying to encourage him to continue. He looked at her, his eyes as intense as ever, but without the usual barriers. "You know, Liv, I've often wondered what it would be like to get out of this hole I've got myself into, but for a long time, I didn't think it was worth it." Liv leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. "And now?" Damien hesitated, but then smiled slightly. Now I see that there can still be something good, something worthwhile." She felt her heart race at those words, but had no chance to reply, because Damien reached across the table and took her hand. "I need you, Liv, but not as a lifeline. I need you as someone with whom I can share what's left of me." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. "I've always been here, Damien." The months that followed were marked by transformations. Damien, for the first time in years, opened the doors to the mansion and to life itself. He began to regain control of his company, something he had put aside since the loss of Eleanor and the baby. Liv was always by his side, not to fix him but to remind him that he didn't have to face everything alone. Margaret, initially resistant, ended up accepting the relationship between the two, although she kept her critical eye on Liv. One afternoon, while Liv was in the garden, Damien approached with something in his hands. "What's that?" she asked, smiling curiously. Damien handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter, but not just any letter. It was a letter from Eleanor, which he had never had the courage to open. Liv looked at him in surprise. "Are you sure?" Damien nodded. "I want you to read it with me." The two of them sat down on the bench under the shade of a tree, and Liv opened the letter. "Dear Damien, if you're reading this, it means that things didn't turn out the way we'd hoped. I want you to know that you are the love of my life, and that no matter what happens, I'll never blame you. Please don't blame yourself either. The happiness you gave me was worth more than anything. I hope you find peace and never forget what an incredible man you are. I love you." Liv finished reading in a broken voice, while Damien stared at the floor, fighting back tears. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew I'd blame myself." Liv held his hand tightly. "Because she knew how much you loved her." Damien finally allowed the tears to fall, and Liv hugged him, holding him as if she could carry some of the weight he had been bearing alone for so long. A year later, the mansion was unrecognizable. It was no longer a place of silence and shadows, but of life and laughter. Damien had regained the joy he thought he had lost forever, and next to Liv, he finally allowed himself to dream again. One sunny afternoon, in the same garden where so many important conversations had taken place, Damien knelt down in front of Liv, now 5 months pregnant. "You changed my life, Liv. You showed me that I could be happy again. And now, I want to spend every day by your side and that of our son who is on the way, trying to make you as happy as you made me." Liv put her hands to her face, already crying, as he took a small box out of his pocket. "Will you marry me?" She couldn't speak, she just nodded, throwing herself into his arms as they both laughed and cried. At that moment, everything Damien had lost was replaced by something new, the certainty that he deserved to be happy. And Liv, with her insistence, curiosity, and unwavering love, had become the anchor he never knew he needed. Together they rebuilt their lives, proving that even after the greatest of losses, love was still capable of healing the deepest wounds. If you enjoyed this emotional story full of twists and turns, let me know in the comments what rating it deserves, from 0 to 10. I'd love to know. Don't forget to leave your like, it helps me a lot. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe to my channel and help me reach the 30,000 subscribers mark. Oh, and be sure to watch the next video that appears here for you. There's a beautiful and moving story that I'm sure will touch your heart. Thanks for being here with me, and see you next time.